Humans love telling stories about battles, which means that over time we've accumulated thousands and thousands of myths, legends, oral traditions, books, video games, comic books and films about the use of various types of weapon. But as these things become more and more enshrined in the stereotypes of fantasy, sometimes the way that they're used in that media doesn't really reflect the reality. Now, is this a problem? Of course not. As long as the stories themselves work, it doesn't really matter how realistic they are. But I personally find it fascinating to compare the way that these things were used in real life with the way they're used in fantasy. So here are 5 weapons that fantasy absolutely loves to get wrong. Hi, my name's David, aka Bluminac, and if you're used to watching my channel, you've probably seen me prattling about, doing trick shots, swinging swords, or even flipping around on a pole. But today it's bloody freezing, so I've put on some boots and I've grabbed some different weapons and we're going to talk about fantasy versus reality. So first off, a disclaimer. I flipping love fantasy stories. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Everything I do comes out of love for the genre. And just because I'm talking about the difference between fantasy and reality doesn't mean that the fantasy is bad. There are many cases in which the way that these things work in fantasy fiction is for a reason. And that stereotype actually is probably more useful to the stories they tell than the reality would be. So bear that in mind, we're going to compare it, but I will try and do justice to the spirit of the fantasy as well where I can. The second thing that I want to point out is that there are so many weapons I could talk about with this, but there are only a few weapons that I actually have in my shed. So those are the ones that we're going to start off with, and as I accumulate more, we can do more of this kind of thing. Now, I love fantasy stories. I love the settings, I love the characters, and I love the magic. And video games can be a great medium for telling those stories. They put you in a character's shoes, let you be them, move as them, and even make choices for them in a magical world. But no matter how open the game is, or how skilled the character, they're often limited by what the developers thought of, which can get kind of frustrating. Tales of Fablecraft is a digital role-playing game designed to aid and enhance your imagination, providing you with a world and stories and monsters to fight, but letting you decide and imagine how those fights take place. It's similar to a classic tabletop RPG, but with dice rolls, mechanics, character creation, maps, and encounters all already included within the game. It's easy to just pick up and dive into. The latest expansion, Once Upon a Wildwood, takes you into a magical forest filled with mystery, monsters, and goodness knows what. So whatever your fantasy, grab a group of friends and let imagination take the reins with Tales of Fablecraft. Download from the link below or in my bio. So first off, because we've got to start somewhere, let's talk about knives or daggers. As with any type of weapon, there are absolutely hundreds of these things in various different forms, variations, etc. So we're going to talk in quite general terms. Knives or daggers in fiction fulfill a few different purposes. They're usually used by stealthy characters or characters who are fast and light on their feet. And like with any weapon in fantasy, the set of moves that you're likely to see people using in combat are not necessarily anything like the ones you'd expect to see in an actual fight. But given that watching actual fights is nowhere near as much of a spectator sport as films are, we can probably give that a little bit of a pass for the purpose of this. What I'm mostly interested in the ways in which the function of the weapon is completely different from how it would work in real life. And there's a couple of different aspects we can talk about with the knife. The first of which is throwing. In real life, throwing weapons tend to be, dare I say, a bit of a gimmick. Not in all cases, but a lot of the time, they are more of a demonstration of skill than an actual practical combat technique. And throwing knives tend to be somewhat different in appearance from a knife that's designed as a melee backup. They're lighter, they're more balanced, they tend to have fewer guards and grips and things on the handle, and they fly a bit better. In fantasy, any knife that you have in your hand can be thrown with perfect accuracy to make a kill every single time. But there's a few problems with this. One is that if you throw a knife, it tends to spin in the air. So I can throw it from here and it will stick, but if I stand here, it's the wrong number of spins and it doesn't do much good. And yes, there are no spin techniques that some people are really good at using that will make it stick at a different distance. I'm not as good at those. but you get the idea. But even if you can reliably throw a knife, the big problem with doing that is that now I don't have a knife anymore. It's all the way over there, and somebody running this way has just left me without what is probably, in most cases, going to be my last line of defense. Which brings me to my second point, which is that knives for warriors, soldiers, scouts, etc. were pretty much always a last line of defense. You might carry one of these for self-defense if you can't take any other weapons with you, and if you get ambushed, then yes, you're going to want to fight with it. But no matter how skilled you are and how good you are with a knife fight, the number one rule of knife fighting is don't be in a knife fight. Because there are almost no winners in those kind of fights. And yes, that means that somebody going into a fight with just a knife and slaying many people is a huge demonstration of how skilled they are. Which is the biggest difference for me from the fantasy. Because in fantasy, you can be a knife fighter. You can make your D&D character and they can grab a dagger and yet it'll do a little bit less damage, but it's reasonably effective. Now there are cultures that use knives more often and were more likely to be intending to use the knife. Say Vikings in a shield wall would often switch to a long sax, which was longer than this, as the name suggests, but essentially a large knife, so they could get in and do some jabbing. And many short swords throughout history were functionally just a big knife. But that's in conjunction with a shield. And it's after you've used your spears. There are very few situations where this is your first line of melee defense. They're light and small and easy to carry, and you take it as well as your other equipment. But this is a backup for your backup. An archer going into battle would run out of arrows or get enemies coming too close, and then they would draw a sword and a buckler, or pick a poleaxe off the floor. And only when things got too bad for that, when the enemy were right in close and brawling, would you take out your knife and jab at them. And functionally, a lot of the reason for that comes down to reach. If I have a knife like this, I have that much reach. But if I have an axe, I have that much reach. So somebody coming at me with a knife doesn't even have to get into a point where they can hit me, and I can start whacking them and slashing them and generally causing them to have a bad day. It's very, very difficult to use a very short weapon to beat someone with a longer one. You have to be better than them, you have to be faster than them, and you have to be luckier than them. And that is not a set of odds that most people would gamble on. So why doesn't fantasy do that? The answer, as it will be with many weapons, is because it's cool. It's cool to see a character with just a small knife take on 5 people armed with swords and win. It's cool to see somebody sneak around and take out 17 people before anyone even knows they're there using only a dagger. It's cool for the archer to run out of arrows and then draw 2 things which are functionally basically arrows from their back and charge in with them. So in many cases, the storytelling trumps the reality and the knives become more important than they would have been historically. Interestingly, it's worth noting that in a more modern setting or an urban setting, such as, say, the John Wick films, it's potentially more plausible for knives to play a larger role in melee combat because you are in a smaller space, you're more likely to be in close proximity with people, and the people you're in close proximity with are less likely to have something like this to fend you off with. So, speaking of which, let's have a look at this thing. This is an axe, and once again, I'm going to be talking in fairly general terms about axes. There are lots of axes. This particular one is a Polish self-defense tool. It's designed to be used as a walking stick while traveling through the mountains, and then not as the occasion arises. It's got a spike on the butt end of it, it's got a small hammer on this side, and it's essentially a short poleaxe. There are battle axes, there are hand axes, there are throwing axes, there are tomahawks, there are Dane axes, there are all kinds of different axes used for different purposes. But thankfully, the way that fantasy gets them wrong applies to almost all of them. Because the main issue with axes in fantasy is one of scale. In a fantasy setting, this would represent a pretty small axe, probably a one-handed kind of jobby. But realistically, if I want to be able to swing this with any control, this is two-handed. And that's because this is a tool. This is designed for splitting wood, For splitting wood, it needs to be heavy. It's going through something very, very solid. And it doesn't need to be fast. As long as I can get it around and over and into the wood, then it's done its job. Whereas this thing, if it doesn't kill in its first strike, then it needs to be able to recover. I need to be able to make a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth attack if the occasion calls for it. And what you see throughout history generally is that axe heads are a lot smaller on axes designed for fighting than on axes designed for use in wood chopping. This axe has an area this large. If I swing it at something's chest and it's armoured, then that is the size of the hole I have to make in the armour with my swing. If I want to get this thing through some armour, it's got an extra sort of 50% on that, which is going to make it that little bit harder to penetrate. It's also a chunk wider, so if I want it to penetrate further in, this is going to have more and more problems doing that. Once again, good for splitting wood, which is hard, but splits down the grain. Not so good if you want to split a tin can. Which brings us to fantasy. In fantasy, it is incredibly rare, whether it's a video game or a film, to see an axe that is about the right size for a combat axe. You've got to remember, even the big, long, 6-foot Dane axes with the big curved blade had a very, very thin profile to keep the weight down so that you'd be able to keep swinging the thing over and over and over and over, using the momentum to drive away your enemies. If you have an axe with a head that's this big and this thick, the actual mass of steel on the end of that is enormous. And even if you're a big, brawny bloke, a lot heavier than I am, you're gonna struggle to get any speed and control on that thing. And somebody with something even like this is gonna block aside your first attack, swing that into your face, and then follow up before you've even made a second strike. Which brings me to the other thing about axes in real life, is that they were brutal. Yes, they were a heavy weapon compared with, say, a sword or a knife, but there was finesse to the use of an axe in battle. It's got a hook on it that you can use for disarming and controlling an opponent's weapon. If you choke it up somewhere down the handle, then you have an extra length here that you can use for reprisals, or even for using a block where you take the enemy's weapon coming in and use it to power your own strike towards them. There are lots and lots of different techniques for fighting with different types of axes because they were used a lot in history. They're a lot cheaper to make than a sword. So there was a lot of times when you would have an axe available to you and not a sword. So why is the fantasy so different? Number one is because of things like this. The average axe that most people will see in their day-to-day lives is a wood chopping axe or a wood splitting axe, and those are big. So when you think about an axe being used in combat, you start off with something like this, and then you think, well, it's not a tool, it has to be more dangerous than that, and to most people, more dangerous equals bigger with more of a cutting edge. So the stereotypical character that uses an axe is somebody that fights in a very brutal way. And what better way to show that visually than to have their strikes be heavy and slow and powerful, sending people flying across the room and bisecting them, rather than being light and fast and having control over the weapon. So in this case, it's very much a visual language of trying to show the story you want to tell and the character you want to tell using the big heavy weapon. In video games, there's also the matter of balance. Swords already exist. So if you want your axe to feel significantly different and your video game is not complex enough to involve like hooking and disarming mechanics, or to really portray much in the way of difference in reach, then you're gonna up the damage. But damage is king in a video game environment because fear and things like that aren't very important. So when you up the damage, you need to decrease the speed. And then to make that plausible, you increase the size, and you gradually head towards the ridiculous great axes of fantasy fiction. So once again, the fantasy doesn't match the reality, but the fantasy has a reality all of its own. It's telling a particular type of story using the fantasy axe as a visual aid for that. It's not a problem, it kind of works, but I would love to see some more fast, skilled and controlled axe work in films, because there's a lot of potential for some very cool combat with it. But I've been carrying some arrows on my back this whole time. I've already spoken about bows from trees, so let's have a look at these things. As some of you will already know, if you watch my channel, this is my specialty. Bows are my favourite. They are the thing that I started with first, and I can and do spend a lot of time talking about the difference between fantasy and reality bows. So let's go again. Like every weapon I have spoken about or will speak about today, bows come in a variety of different shapes, sizes and cultures. And what is true of one is not necessarily true of another. So we're going to be stereotyping here. But in general, a bow is a way of launching a pointy stick at somebody that you don't like. In fantasy, these things can be fast, or they can be more like slow sniper weapons. They can shoot multiple arrows at once in a spread, or launch ridiculous trick arrowheads. They are wielded by stealthy, dexterous characters and deal devastating damage at range, with the caveat of leaving you somewhat vulnerable up close. And like with many things in fiction, pretty much all of that is true, for a given value of true. For starters, although modern target archery prioritizes accuracy over speed, and several forms of medieval war archery probably prioritized power over speed, there are several forms of archery that utilize speed as a priority. Although they're all a fair bit harder to do in the cold. Shooting multiple arrows at once probably wasn't a particularly common historical technique, but it does work. And you can use it to hit multiple targets. Trick arrows like boxing gloves and grappling shots were definitely rare if they existed at all. But fire arrows, poison arrows, rope cutters, blunt arrows and barbed arrows were all used for various different purposes. And while the most agile archery used in battle was probably mostly done from horseback, shooting from a raised position, or even upside down, is more than possible. And displays of acrobatic archery have been performed since as long ago as ancient Greece. So why is it included in this video? Well, firstly, because it's my thing, but secondly, because there are a couple of aspects to how bows are portrayed in fiction that don't match up to how they would work in real life. And the first is what happens when you get close to an enemy. Because characters in fiction will frequently continue using their bow right up until their enemy is this far away from them. And then they will do some point-blank shooting, or some stabbing with an arrow, or even whacking with the bow. And while there are very rare examples of bows that were made to be able to be used partially as melee weapons, the fact is that A, it's really damaging to the bow, and B, they're a lot less useful as melee weapons than melee weapons. An archer worth their salt who has come equipped for battle rather than someone who's out hunting and gets caught off guard is likely to be carrying at the very least a sword or an axe, and possibly also a buckler, a small shield, so that when the enemy starts to look like they might get close, you don't keep shooting. You discard your bow and draw a proper melee defense. So yes, archers wouldn't have been as well equipped as somebody that came in with a big pike or something like that as their primary weapon, and because of the mobility requirements of a bow, then they probably wouldn't be as heavily armoured around the shoulders as somebody that has come equipped for just shoulder barging people and using heavy close-range weaponry. But they certainly wouldn't be defenceless, and they would very, very rarely, unless taken completely by surprise, be resorting to using this to defend themselves. But that's a minor point, that's rule of cool, because when you've designed a character to be using a particular weapon set, visually and thematically, you want them to continue using that weapon set. It looks awesome for them to continue jabbing and stabbing with arrows and shooting in a range that frankly wouldn't be practical in real life, and it keeps that character looking like that character when you've got a bunch of other people fighting in different ways with swords and axes. Plus, from a choreography standpoint, it gives you the opportunity to do some very cool interplay of ranged and melee attacks to create move sets that you otherwise wouldn't be able to employ. By the way, I'm really sorry about the really bad lighting here. It's genuinely daylight in theory, but it's Britain in late autumn, so This is all I got to work with. In theory, the sun is somewhere up in that. But the other thing that's frequently got wrong about bows is that they are portrayed in fiction as requiring 0 strength to draw. This is a relatively mid-range bow. It's 60 pounds draw, but that means that every time I pull this back, I'm taking 60 pounds of strain across my shoulders. So if I want to keep repeatedly pouring arrows into a target, then that's 20 odd kilograms of weight that I'm pulling back for every single shot. And over time and lots of arrows, that is going to get tiring and it is going to require some strength. War bows that were used in heavy battle could be 2, 3, 3.5 times as heavy as this to pull back. And the people that were drawing them were not skinny, waifish cartoon figures. They were strong, powerful, and very, very heavily built. So when you see characters in films or TV drawing back a bow, and they obviously don't have a lot of muscle tone, and then they're pulling back the bow as though it's nothing, and you can't see any tension in the muscles of their arms or their back or their fingers, it looks weird. It looks like that bow doesn't have any power. And the same thing for video games or TTRPGs, when a character only needs dexterity to be able to aim a bow, and they can completely dump their strength stat. That bow should not be doing any significant amount of damage to someone in armor. So what gives? Why all the waifish archers? There's a bunch of different reasons for this. One is that it's a way of keeping your scrawny looking characters off the front lines. Visually speaking, we expect people who are fighting in melee on the front lines of combat to look big and strong. And we expect people who are staying back and doing ranged things to look scrawny. It's a trope, it's a stereotype. It comes from things like David and Goliath. It comes from hunters versus warriors. It comes from the fact that archery was a women's sport and a martial art that women could practice in Victorian England onwards and in feudal Japan at times when it wouldn't have been seemly for a woman to be swinging an axe. So there's a whole bunch of things that create this more graceful, this less strong stereotype for bows. Also, the bows that you use in films for safety reasons are not strong and powerful bows. And usually, when you want somebody to act in a film, you employ an actor. And that actor may not have experience of drawing strong and powerful bows. So if your training is not up to scratch, or if it's not a priority in the scene, then the tension and the weight of the bow can get forgotten about and left behind in favor of the emotions and the storytelling. I get it. And when it comes to video games or TTRPGs that use stats, this is a problem for every single weapon. There is no weapon in the world that only requires strength and not agility or dexterity to wield. Even a massive sword, once you get it moving and you're using your strength, then it's more a case of coordination to be able to actually hit what you're aiming for. And for a bow, yes, you need strength to draw it back. You also need coordination to aim it. It's going to be a combination of the two. But for a video game, it turns out you don't want to need intelligence and perception and dexterity and strength to all be maxed out to be able to use any given weapon effectively. So they rely on one of them, and that makes sense. And if you want to create tropes where your archers are fast and agile, which is really cool, and that is one of my favorite tropes of an archer, is the like speedy, great movement kind of guy, then you're going to probably link it to other things related to speed and agility. It's a simplification and it's a storytelling tool. But it would be nice to occasionally see a little bit more of the kind of archery that emphasizes that, yes, you do need at least some strength to be able to do this. Now, my fingers are starting to go numb, so to give them a break from shooting a bow, we're going to switch to talking about the bow's sibling and rival, the crossbow. I have gone on at length about the difference between bows and crossbows before, and I will do so again. But functionally, crossbows are like bows that take a bunch of things that are normally part of the human body and make it into part of the machine. You can keep them at full draw for longer, you can move around with them at full draw, and they are a lot easier to learn to use effectively. For a bow like this, this is a 175-pound draw crossbow. It's a bit of a faff for me to be able to cock it, because I've got to put my foot through a stirrup and use two hands, but assuming I can get my boot through, then I can get 175 pounds of draw into this. I can't pull back 175 bow. I'm stuck somewhere around 120 at the moment. So this has a heavier draw weight than a bow that I could use. And in theory, I could crank that up with a crank or an additional gadget to be able to use a bow that is a crossbow of 600, 1,000, 1,500 pounds. As long as you've got the leverage in your cocking mechanism, then you can draw back and shoot something with a lot of power in it. The downside of that, and the thing that is often forgotten about when you talk about power in a crossbow, is that they are always a lot shorter, or almost always a lot shorter than an equivalent bow. And they had their monstrously high draw weight to compensate for that shortness. The amount of energy that a bow imparts is a function not only of its draw weight, but also of its draw length. So the actual energy that this thing puts into an arrow is actually less overall than my 60-pound bow that I was using earlier. And you can see that in penetration tests, both of bows of this kind of like mid-hunting weight, and also of heavier war bows and heavy war crossbows. You still, on average, tend to get slightly better penetration out of a top-end war bow than a top-end war crossbow of the same time period. But the fictional bow is slightly different, because they can look like this, and they can be held like this, and carried like that, and shot like that. They are used as replacements for guns in fiction that is set at periods when guns didn't exist. It's not the only thing that they're used for, and it's not the only stereotype of them, but it is the primary one. And what that tends to result in is crossbows that are powerful and fast. But in real life, you tend to get one or the other. Repeating crossbows did exist, and they were made, but to be able to consistently cock back and shoot, it needs to be able to be cocked back relatively easily. This is probably the fastest crossbow that I have access to. It's only 80-pound draw, which is over a quite short span. It can be cocked as quickly as that. If it had a feeding mechanism, then you'd be able to shoot it every sort of 2-3 seconds. But as you can see, the power on it isn't actually enough to pierce into that target at this range. So it is not as good. And while something like this is still relatively fast for a crossbow because it doesn't require a crank to be pulled back, it takes a good few seconds and a fair amount of effort to get it ready to shoot in exchange for the power that you get out of it. Compare that with the speed and ease with which I was shooting the 60-pound bow earlier, and it's actually the bows that were the rapid shooting weapons at the time. Crossbows are not guns. Or at least they are, but they are early guns. They are a thing that you get lots and lots of people with to shoot. Now, I understand the desire for fantasy guns, and it does look very, very cool when someone comes in dual-wielding crossbows and they pow, pow. But after that, they should be chucking them away and switching to something else. And the thing is, crossbows were very, very effective. They were used in war a lot, especially in cultures that didn't have a sort of constant rotation of people learning to use war bows. And the tactics that were used with crossbows are fascinating because it has a lot of options that you don't have available to you with a regular bow. You can keep this thing cocked, and you can cock it separately from aiming it. So they were really, really useful for using with shields. And the best tactics and the most fascinating tactics to see that were used with crossbows involved using like essentially mobile cover. Big shields you could plant in the ground, wind up your crossbow, and then get back behind your shield. And that would be fascinating to see more of if we can stop using them as guns and start using them as what they actually were. But I've got one more weapon left to do, and it's cold and it's starting to rain, so let's crack on with it. This is a big sword. Call it what you will. Greatswords, Zweihander, Claymore, Rachel. Lots of cultures had a dirty great sword at some point in their history. And in many cases, the names for them simply mean big sword, or two-handed, or big, or pillar. They were named for being huge. And it is. This damn thing is about 2 meters, which is taller than me. And it's a fair weight. It's about 3.6 kilos, which is something when it comes to swinging it around. But in fiction, a sword of this length would be probably at least as wide as the span of these hooks. It would have probably 6, 7, 8 times as much steel going into it, and it would weigh comparatively 6, 7, 8 times as much at least. Swords in fiction can be 20 pounds, they can be 100 pounds in some of the more ridiculous cases. And without really losing very much in the way of length, they can add a huge amount of mass. Sometimes with a much shorter handle, which gives you a lot less leverage. And that's because swords in fiction are frequently axes, realistically. The way that these things tend to be used is with a big, two-handed overhead swing down like that. And there were swords that were used in that sort of way. They were called execution swords. They were for using on a target that wasn't going anywhere, and they were for making a single decisive cut through. And they were broader than this, and they were heavier than this, but this is a battle sword. This is a sword that would have been used either for attacking ranks of pikemen, in which case you use the weight and the momentum of it to bat aside their weapons, occasionally with a spin that gets you into range to then hit the person holding it immediately afterwards. Or it's a space clearer, the type of weapon that will be wielded by bodyguards and people that generally wanted to stop you going that way. So they would stand here and swing it about, using as much of the momentum as they could to keep you from getting into that space. And for that, it needs to be heavy, sure. It needs to have some mass. It needs to have a big, long cutting surface. But it's not a big, slow fantasy weapon, because it also needs to be able to be moved quickly. And a big function of these, to be able to move them quickly, is working with rather than against the momentum of the weapon. And that's where the fantasy ones go wrong, because even if you have a massive, massive sword and you're super, super strong, you are much better off making your swings continue the motion from strike to be able to hit repeatedly, time and again, than you are swinging the thing into the ground and then lifting it up and starting again. So why has this happened? Why has what is essentially a relatively finessed bit of gear that could be used in one-to-one duels, as well as for space clearing, as well as for tactical movements on a battlefield, become a giant cleaver for chopping? Well, in some cases, like video games or TTRPGs, it can come down to balance. The fact that you can chop over a much larger area, or that it is harder for someone else to get into your reach while you're swinging the thing, is a lot harder to portray in simple single-target games, or even in video games particularly. Whereas just saying, here is twice as much damage, but it's slow to compensate, allows you to use the same mechanics that the rest of the game is using, and make your sword feel different and special for being big, while still being balanced with the smaller, lighter blades. But there's another factor too. Rule of cool is always at play, and these kind of swords have been prone to exaggeration for a really, really long time. Several museums around the world contain examples of swords which are realistically too big to have been used in combat, in some cases by quite a long way. But people have tales of giant warriors wielding massive swords, and it was often a challenge or a fun thing for a blacksmith to do, was to use their skill to make the biggest sword they possibly could, and then it would get put on display somewhere as someone's ancestor's massive sword. in much the same way as people these days tend to make video game weapons, not necessarily because they're expecting to use them, but because they look cool. And the existence of these massive swords in museums and collections distorts the popular opinion of what a massive sword would be and how a massive sword would be used. But it also creates a legacy that these characters like Guts from Berserk, or Dante from Devil May Cry with his ridiculous one-handed 6-foot sword, can then follow on. Is it a problem? No. Are they incredibly cool? Yes. I would not own a 2-meter long sword if I didn't think that these characters with their massive swords in fiction were cool. But it's also fascinating to me that I can move a lot faster with this than I could if I was a video game character. So, there you have it. 5 weapons, 5 fantasy stereotypes which are loosely connected to 5 realities. Remember, all of these things are storytelling tools, and the way that they're used will vary depending on the story that's being told. Even here, I'm trying to tell a story. I'm trying to give you information about 5 things and how they were used in reality and how that differs from fantasy in a space of time that is much less than what it would take to do this justice. There are things I've glossed over, there are generalizations that I've made, and there are things that I will have missed. So, do your own research if you need to, but if you need more info, you want more answers, you've got questions, or you want some tutorials on how to do some of the archery stuff I talk about, I'm here for that. Check out the links below and have a great day.